producer. I work for the International Energy Agency, which is based in Paris. I'm in charge of energy markets and security. The International Energy Agency was created in 1974, mainly dealing with energy security issue. But since it has broadened its approach towards energy policy and look at energy policy especially for OECD countries in terms of energy security, climate change, economic development. So it's a much broader approach. And my objective today, just to kick off this meeting, is to give you an overview about how we see the energy markets developing in the coming years until 2030. We publish every year a book called the World Energy Outlook, which gives some scenarios for the future of the industry, of the energy markets. And this presentation is basically based on the last edition of this book. I'm afraid you will have to support a French accent this morning because we are several French speakers today, but I hope you can cope with that. So let me start now with a general, just to set the scene from a general perspective. What is the context of the global energy markets? It's first the consequences of the recession we had last year and this huge economic crisis. For the first time, energy consumption went down in 2009. We are seeing a very sharp recovery now. How fast, how sustainable, this remains to be seen. We also had big volatility in energy prices, mainly in oil prices, with the price collapse at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, and then a rebound, and now new worries about the potential new oil price shock. Slump in energy investment during the financial and economic crisis, but we are seeing a rebound now. The question is, will it be sufficient to meet increasing demand, especially in emerging countries, going forward? And then the very strong link between climate change policy and energy developments. And we will talk briefly about the consequences of the Copenhagen conference. So to start with, this is a general chart showing how we see in our World Energy Outlook the global perspective in terms of energy demand by 2030. As you can see, even if energy demand, energy use was set to fall in 2009 for the first time since 1981, it's as a result of the financial and economic crisis. It's going to resume its long-term upward trend as economic recovery is consolidating. In the reference scenario, which is the scenario shown here, which is what we see, what would happen if there is no change in energy policy in the world. So it's a kind of business of as usual scenario, but it doesn't mean we think this is first the most likely. Second, the more desirable. Actually, it's something that should not happen, that we have to correct through new energy policy. As you can see in this reference scenario, demand would increase by 40% by 2030, with non-OECD countries accounting for 93% of the increase in demand, their share of global primary energy demand rising from 52 to 63%. China accounts for around 40% of the global increase in primary energy use, and India 15%. Outside Asia, the Middle East is also seeing a very fast increase in its energy consumption. How the market share of various energy sources will change over the time. What is the key message is that the fossil fuels in this reference scenario would remain the dominant sources of energy worldwide, accounting for nearly 80% of the demand increase over the period of time. Although oil demand is expected to drop by around 2% in 2009, it is projected to recover as the economy pulls out of recession, rising to around 85 million barrels per day this year to 105 million barrels per day in 2030, an increase of around 24%. Coal would grow by around 50%, even if for the first time we see OECD coal demand declining. So all the coal increase is coming in emerging countries. Natural gas demand would grow by around 40% by 2030. And what is most significant this year is a very steep increase of renewable energy, as well as especially non-hydro renewable energy, which would increase from very sharply from current levels. But if you look at the contribution of renewable energy in the energy mix, it remains very low, considering the development of other energy in 2030. Let's have a look on investment, because a lot of investment will be needed to meet this growing demand and the impact of the crisis on investment. As you can see here, global upstream spending fell in 2009 for the first time after a very sharp increase of investment. But it's rebounding this year in 2010, according to our forecast. Although these are nominal spending, and the crisis has had also a very huge impact on the cost of the project, because during the sharp rise of investment between 2004 and 2008, we saw a very sharp increase of cost of new oil and gas projects, and there has been some decline of cost in 2009, which has partly compensated for the lower level of investment. It's to be expected yet that now, with the economic rebound, especially the sharp increase of commodity prices, especially steel, that this decline in cost will probably have leveled off now. The need for investment is also very much linked to the huge impact of decline rates in the oil supply. The bulk of oil production is based on quite aging oil fields. As you can see on this chart, a sustained investment will be needed to compensate the decline rates that we estimate between 6 and 7% per year, which means that we will have to find and develop quite a big amount of new oil fields. And also, as you can see on this chart, natural gas liquids that are their contribution is increasing in the liquid oil supply mix, together with the development of gas supply, as well as unconventional oil, like oil sands in Canada, which are bringing a more significant contribution to oil supply. The era of cheap energy is over, despite all the uncertainty about oil prices, and I'll come back to that later on. We are considering that in the long term, the price of energy, especially the price of oil, is going to be higher, because the cost of the marginal barrel is going to increase. Oil is more difficult to produce, whether it is very deep offshore, like in Brazil, or unconventional oil in Canada. You have a lot of resources that are more costly to produce. And as the consequence of that is that we see the average annual expenditure on net imports of oil and gas as a share of GDP will double in the EU and in the United States by 2030.
And with projected sharp increases in demand in emerging countries, this indicator will rise from 1 to 3% in China and from 3 to 6% in India. At the same time, more efforts will be needed to combat energy poverty and provide broader access to electricity to the 1.5 billion people that don't have access to energy. Just I don't want to go into the details about the uncertainties in terms of oil supply, just a brief reference to Iraq. There is a lot of discussion about the potential of Iraqi oil. There are plenty of resources in Iraq that could be developed at at much cheaper prices, and it could possibly be a game changer when you look in the medium to long term. But of course, with a lot of uncertainty in terms of political framework, security of activities in Iraq. But even if the very ambitious targets of the Iraqi government, which is to bring their production to 12 million barrels per day, around the same level as Saudi Arabia, it would certainly change the picture. I would like just now, having said that about the long-term trend, which are certainly very bullish because of, first, the need to compensate for decline rates of existing production, plus to meet increasing demand in emerging countries. And with the development of emerging countries and the increase in population, these long-term trends are certainly very widely shared. When you look at the medium term, you have much more uncertainty. So it's much more difficult to foresee what's going to happen on oil markets in the 5 years to come. This chart shows you how we see the perspective in terms of oil markets for the medium term. And you see here in this scenario, which is a high GDP scenario, a growth rate of the world economy at around 4%, which is what is forecast this year by the IMF. We see also some improvement in the supply, as you can see on the green chart, and so a spare capacity that would decline at around 4 million barrels per day in 2014. At 2 million barrels per day, it's a left scale, which means a very tight market again, and possibly new price surge as we had in 2007, 2008, in 5 years to come. But if we take another assumption in terms of economic growth, and we have a lower GDP scenario, then you see a very, very direct impact on oil demand, and with very limited change in terms of oil supply. So you end up with a much more comfortable spare capacity at the end of the period, and possibly some more stability in oil prices. So the message here is that even if the long-term trend is clear, in the medium term, the uncertainty about economic growth and some improvement in terms of supply in the short term makes the visibility in terms of oil prices much more difficult to assess. There's been a lot of discussion about the price of oil and price formation, and some polarization of arguments. Is it about the physical factors that can have explained why the price of oil reached around more than $140 per barrel at mid-2008, or is it the impact of the financial market and speculation on commodities, and specifically on oil? Our opinion in the IEA is that there is a series of factors that are at play, as you can see here, and even if the role of the impact of the financial crisis and the amount of money that came onto commodity markets, especially oil markets, has certainly amplified the trends upwards and downwards on the oil markets. At the end of the day, the anticipation of the markets in terms of future balances of supply and demand looking forward are the key elements to explain price formation. Of course, at the same time, price inelasticity of demand and supply in the short term contribute to this amplification of price swings. Let me now move to the natural gas sector. Natural gas, there was a special focus in our World Energy Outlook on gas evolution. The gas market is seeing now drastic changes with increasing, a trend of increasing demand, but also some drastic changes in terms of supply. This is the vision for the long term. The first point is also the need for investment is first justified by the decline of existing fields. In the reference scenario, we see gas supply increase by 42%, and we calculated that the output from currently producing fields in aggregate will increase marginally between now and 2015, and then fall back to around half current levels as fields are depleted and their production rates decline. Taking into account this decline, we project that additional capacity of more than 2,700 billion cubic meters is needed by 2030 to satisfy world demand, which will increase, which means that this capacity is equal to 4 times the current Russian production capacity. So this additional capacity will be needed 50% to offset the decrease of supply from existing fields, and the remainder is required to meet the increase of global demand. There has been a huge game changer, which is the increase of unconventional gas production in the United States. That was pretty unexpected. I mean, especially the amount and the importance of this increase of production of unconventional gas. As you can see here, the supply. The production of gas in the the supply of gas in the United States will be covered more and more by unconventional gas, as you can see on the red curve, and with a demand of gas that is not expected to increase very significantly over the period of time. We have a big change. In terms of foreign trade compared to what was expected before, is that the United States will be self-sufficient in gas supply, with, as you can see on the blue part of the bars, their need to import either from Canada or from other sources through LNG will remain very limited for quite a long time. And this, of course, has an impact, even if gas markets are very different in various regions of the world. The fact that the US are not going to import massively in the coming years has an impact in other regions of the world in terms of LNG supply that is being made available for other parts of the world. So you see here the consequence of this game changer on the capacity of gas transportation, which is available for other parts of the world. We see in the reference scenario gas trade globally increasing by almost 60%. And this is linked to the very important increase of LNG trade that will reach 40% of gas exchanges by 2030. The LNG business is actually in the midst of an unprecedented expansion, with a number of liquefaction plants due to be commissioned in the next few years. In the short term, with the impact of the crisis on demand, much lower demand for gas, because gas is to a large extent linked to industrial and power consumption that was directly hit by the recession. And at the same time, this new supply coming on stream in the US, you can see that there is an underutilization of existing transportation capacity. And a form of gas glut that is happening in the short term on gas market that explain that the utilization rate of this transportation capacity has dropped from around 90% to less than 3/4. This is a forecast until by 2015. So it's a short-term gas glut on global markets. How long it will last is quite more difficult to forecast because also this gas glut is enticing producers to postpone a number of investments. So we may have problem over the long term, but in the short term, it's certainly a very well supplied market. This gas glut is also has also important consequences in terms of gas prices in Europe, because we have, and gas prices worldwide, because there is a huge difference between gas prices in the UK or in the US and on spot markets, and gas prices in Europe that are, and in Asia, that are mainly linked to oil prices through long-term contracts with producers. So a big difference in prices that is probably not sustainable, and that will imply some changes either in the pricing formula of long-term contracts or some changes on gas markets, especially in Europe. In Asia, it's a bit different because of the impact of the development of China is maintaining higher prices. Europe is facing also an increasing a number of new investments. As you can see on this chart, the question of producing and delivering gas to Europe markets will be very important to define the future of gas market in Europe, also because the region will become increasingly dependent on imports because the North Sea production is going down sharply. Europe at the same time is very well placed because it can bring LNG from various parts of the world, from the Middle East, from Northern Africa, from Western Africa, and many terminals to import LNGs are being built throughout Europe, also to compensate for the decline of the North Sea. And several pipelines options are also possible. So Europe, to sum up, will be more and more dependent on imports, but has a number of options. But the key question are, will there be enough investment in the upstream, in the supply? What routes will be, what investment will be put in place to meet this increasing demand? And what kind of market reform will take place, because the European market is far from being united. There's a lack of interconnection, and so the speed with which the gas market in Europe will unify will also have an important impact on security of supply in Europe. So, how long will the downward pressure continue on gas prices is an important question. So what changes on oil index pricing, especially in Asia and in Europe? Is the success story of unconventional gas in the US going to be replicated in other parts of the world? Many oil and gas companies are starting some exploration to look at the potential of unconventional gas in Europe, in China, but the majority expectation is that there's certainly some potential, but certainly not as important as in the US. And last but not least, the pace of global economic recovery will be key, of course, to see how long this gas glut will last and if the gas and electricity demand recovers more or less quickly. Actually, demand uncertainty what is important, this is a chart about the evolution of electricity consumption. Consumption has increased on a very regular basis since the Second World War, and 2009 actually was a one-year exception with the decline of global electricity demand. This is certainly a parenthesis, and because we're going to see in the longer term a huge growth of electricity demand, especially with first the need of a large fraction of the world population to have access to electricity, with also the need to go towards a low carbon economy, and electricity is the key option to meet that goal. And thirdly, the prospect of decarbonization of the transportation sector, which will go through an increasing role of electricity. So the number of people without having access to electricity, you have here a map showing the situation in 2008 and in 2030. In summary, we forecast some progress. So the number of people without access to electricity, if current change are maintained, will go down, but not very significantly, from 1.5 billion people to 1.3 billion people, whereby the need in terms of a level of investment to extend this access to electricity is not that huge if you compare to the global need for investment in the electricity sector over the period of time. Because if we look at the global need for investment by 2030, around 50% of it is linked to the electricity sector. First, to increase access to electricity, to meet increasing demand in emerging countries, but also to change the fleet in OECD countries, which is aging. And this is a key issue of energy policy. What is going to be the energy mix in the power sector, also in the US, in Europe, and in other OECD countries? Let me now move to the what we call the 400 ppm scenario. So I mentioned several times the reference scenario, which is the business as usual scenario. The 450 scenario is a scenario which is a voluntary scenario in which efforts would be made to limit the increase of temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius by 2030. Which would be the equivalent to a 50% chance of keeping temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. So this is a voluntary scenario. There are maybe other ways to meet that goal than in this particular scenario, but it's linked to what is underway in OECD countries and what is doable also in emerging countries through a combination of various policy mechanisms. Which would be, of course, differentiated according to the level of development of countries. And there would be also a graduated approach with first targets in OECD countries up to 2020. Then other major economies also assuming to adopt emission caps. And more developing countries continuing to focus on national measures until 2030. In this scenario, emission of CO2 would peak by 2020 and then go down. And there are two key conditions in this scenario. Is first to have a CO2 price that we estimate at $50 per ton. For power generation and industry in OECD countries. And the second key condition and some financial support to non-OECD countries through carbon markets and co-financing. This is in summary the evolution of fossil fuels and non-carbon fuels in this scenario by 2030. Demand in this scenario, the first thing is that demand growth will be curtailed compared to the reference scenario and would grow by 20% instead of 40%, an average growth of 0.8% per year in this scenario. Demand for fossil fuel would peak by 2020 in this scenario, and the share of zero carbon fuels would increase from 19 to 32% in 2030, when the carbon content of 1 unit of GDP would be less than half today's level. What is the consequences on various energy sources? First, on oil. The message here is also that moving towards a low carbon economy is also positive in terms of energy security, because the oil supply will remain a key question in coming years. And in this scenario, the demand for oil will grow much more slowly and reach only 89 million barrels per day in 2030. So not sort of a stabilization of oil supply over the long term in this scenario. Oil imports in the OECD countries would be even lower than today. And for emerging countries like China, India, oil imports will grow, but much less than in the reference scenario. What you can see here is that in this scenario, the third bar, the supply of oil will be more limited, but the share of OPEC at the same time grows, and which means that of course, there is low need for lower call on OPEC for oil supply in the 450 scenarios, but still an increase compared to current levels, because globally speaking, the share of OPEC will grow, and especially in this 450 scenario. In terms of OPEC oil export revenues, as you can see here, in the 450 scenario, the level of OPEC revenues would be lower than in the reference scenario, but still much higher than what we've seen over the last 20 years. Of course, because we are entering a period of time where oil prices will remain much higher compared to the previous period of time. The role of natural gas will be very important in the 450 scenario, and as we can say that the natural gas will be the transitional fuel towards a lower carbon economy. In the reference scenario, we see gas growing by 1.5% per year, whereby the growth will be a little lower in the 450 scenario, basically because there is more energy efficiency and lower energy demand. But despite that, the consumption of gas will be higher than what it is the case today. And the growth, for instance, the growth between today and 2030 would be around 17%. So it means that globally, less energy consumption, but a wider share for natural gas. This is a chart that summarized what is needed to reach that 450 scenario compared to the reference scenario. We see that CO2 emission would peak before 2020 at around 31 gigatons and then fall sharply. Efficiency is the first element to meet that goal, as you can see on the right part, especially in the first period of time. By 2020, efficiency gains represent around 2/3 of the efforts that are needed, and almost 60% by 2030. Energy efficiency measures and also higher electricity prices to curb electricity demand growth in industry and buildings. And the second way to meet that goal is to decarbonize electricity production through an increasing share of renewables in the energy mix, as well as nuclear energy and CCS, carbon capture and storage, making coal a potential option with CCS. We also looked at a breakdown by region of the efforts to be made in these scenarios. And as you can see, measures implemented in China, the United States, Europe, India, and Russia, and Japan account for almost 3/4 of the reduction in this scenario. In China, the sectoral standards and policies that are already under consideration could bring a very significant contribution to this policy change. And a key element, as I just said, will be the financing efforts from OECD countries to support the investment that will be needed in non-OECD countries. This is a comparison about the energy mix in the reference scenarios in the 450 scenario, which is another way to show the three key changes that are needed. First, more energy efficiency, which means that globally energy demand will be lower. A massive switch from coal to gas in industry and power. You see that the share of coal is very sharply decreasing. And an increase of low-carbon electricity production in nuclear as well as renewables. In the 450 scenario, you can see that around 60% of global electricity production comes from renewables, 37% of total electricity production, 18% from nuclear, and 5% from fossil fuels with CCS. This, of course, represents a step change from the reference scenario, where fossil fuels still account for about 2/3 of electricity generation. So decarbonization of the electricity sector is one of the key elements of a low-carbon transition. Just one slide on transportation, because to change, of course, the share of fossil fuel is quite dominant in transportation. Today, are we going to see some changes in this sector is a key question for the future. We foresee in our 450 scenario that measures in the transport sector produce more than 10 million barrels per day of oil savings in global oil demand by 2030. Road transport account for the vast majority of saving, as we would see a dramatic shift in car sales to occur, with conventional internal combustion car engines representing some 40% of the sales from 19% of the market today. And we would see hybrid cars take up 30% of sales, and plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles accounting for the remainder. We had this the COP15 conference in Copenhagen that has been in majority seen as a failure, even if there was some positive points. First, broadening the discussion to non-OECD countries and developing countries making some pledges, in addition to the United States that were not part of the Kyoto Protocol. Substantial finance pledge to support developing countries, and the acknowledgement that the 2 degrees Celsius target was accepted by most countries. But at the same time, the current pledges that were announced to the UNFCCC by end of January fall short of that target. There is also some loss of confidence in the global process, and the question being asked whether other processes should be put in place to speed up the negotiation process. And in summary, the bottom line is that huge efforts are still needed to curb CO2 emissions. What do we stand now? If we look at what we try to do, it's to try to summarize all the pledges made by various countries, and we reach a level of abatement of around 550 ppm, which is very far from the target if we look at the pledges that were made at the end of January. But of course, this is an evolving subject with some new discussion upcoming. So let me now summarize and conclude this brief summary of energy markets and future trends. The financial crisis has halted the rise in global fossil energy use, but it hasn't changed so far the long-term upward path. Tackling climate change and enhancing energy security require massive decarbonization of the energy system. And what we call an energy revolution towards a green growth in order to reach this 450 target would have several benefits at the same time. First, of course, in terms of climate change, but also in terms of energy security and lower oil and gas imports and reducing energy bills for consuming countries as a bridge, and I would say a very long bridge to a cleaner energy future. The challenge is enormous, especially when you look at the investment that are needed, but it can be met through energy efficiency, technology deployment that will be critical. And we must bear also in mind that each year of delay adds around $500 billion cost in terms of mitigation of the cost between today of 2030 of compensating of the very serious impact of climate change if they are not met in due time. So the message is there are urgent decisions to be made, because any time delay will have a very negative impact on the global energy markets. Thank you very much for your attention.